Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webcast, Driver Qualification Town Hall, Hot Topics in DQ File Management. My name is Jason Hubbard, and I'll be facilitating today's event. You can find the event tools located at the top of your console. There's also a resource box where you can download a copy of the presentation handouts and other related materials. The Q&A is open throughout the webcast, so please feel free to drop your questions in at any time. We'll do our best to answer them as they come in, but we'll reserve some time specifically for that at the end. For the best viewing experience, we encourage using a high-speed, stable internet connection and close out of any unnecessary browser tabs or applications. If you do happen to experience audio issues or the slides are failing to advance, you can refresh your browser by pressing on F5. Lastly, an on-demand version of today's presentation will be available approximately 2 hours following the event, and that can be accessed using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier. We'll also follow up with that link in an email. Today's webcast is brought to you by the J.J. Keller Encompass Fleet Management System. Encompass is the industry's trusted fleet management solution to help you comply with complex driver and vehicle DOT regulatory requirements. You get exceptional flexibility to manage your fleet from anywhere, making it easier to stay in compliance and on top of fleet management tasks like driver qualification, drug and alcohol testing, hours of service, vehicle legalization and maintenance, accident tracking, and more. So on behalf of our sponsor, we thank you for joining us today. And now let's meet our presenters. We have Mark Shedler and Kathy Close, who are both members of the J.J. Keller Transport Publishing team and contribute to a variety of transportation safety-related products and services. Mark brings 25 years of transportation experience, and as a senior editor, he is a subject matter expert in the areas of driver qualification, passenger carrier compliance, carrier safety best practices, and vehicle safety and alternative fuel technologies. Kathy's career with J.J. Keller began in 1999, where she acted as a third-party administrator, auditing driver qualification files and managing DOT drug and alcohol testing programs. Since 2002, she's been in the role of a transportation editor with a primary focus on driver qualification and DOT drug and alcohol programs. So welcome, Mark and Kathy. And with that, now I will turn it over to Kathy, who's going to get us started with the agenda.
Yep. Thanks, Jason. And thanks everybody for attending today and taking time out of your busy schedules. So here's our agenda. Mark and I are going to focus on the frequently asked questions, and we get so many questions on a daily basis, actually, in driver qualifications. So we're going to touch base on DQ file basics, and that includes medical certification, to motor vehicle records or your driving records, along with some of the consequences of noncompliance. And we'll address as many questions as possible along the way and at the end, but we also would like your feedback on how you handle certain scenarios. So that's a little bit different, different way we're doing our presentation today. So Mark, how are you today?
I'm finer than frog hair. Got up early today to practice like a rolling stone for a half hour. It's my birthday, so what could be any better than that? So we're going to start with a discussion about who the DQ rules apply to. Then we're going to go ahead and ask you to submit your questions, so you can start doing that now. Kathy and I are both DQ versed. Kathy happens to be drug and alcohol savvy as well, but let's get into it. All right, so we get questions like, do we need DQ files for certain drivers? And the biggest misnomer is non-CDL drivers. If you don't have a CDL, you don't need a DQ file, but it really depends on the vehicles your drivers are operating, whether they operate intrastate or interstate. So drivers that are in interstate commerce, that's more than just crossing state lines. It's based on the definition of a CMV from 390.5. It's summarized below. It's the 10,001 pounds and up. Rated or actual, loaner in combination. Then there's the passenger side, 9 or more, including the driver, for compensation, including indirect compensation, and then there's more than 16 with no compensation, and any size vehicle hauling placardable hazmat. So interstate, it doesn't matter if you're private or for hire, but in several states that I'm aware of, they do have a different level. Most of those states start the regulatory requirements at 10,001 for hire, and then private carriers that haul only their own stuff get a break and they don't have to comply until certain levels. Wisconsin, for example, does not do that. They don't regulate until you hit like the CDL definition. So you have to be very careful if you're operating in intrastate commerce and claiming that you don't have to qualify drivers in those non-CDL vehicles. You need to be absolutely sure that your drivers aren't operating in intrastate commerce. So a full DQ file is needed. In every case where a driver operates your CMV, whether that's a temp driver that comes over for a week or whatever, office people that jump in a vehicle CMV and go do something to support the business, even mechanics taking trucks out for test drives on public roadways, anywhere outside of where the public can travel is fair game, and they need a DQ file. And as I said, in intrastate commerce, it depends on the state in which you're operating.
Okay, and dovetailing off of that, that is a question we get a lot. Is, what if we only operate in one state and never cross the border? And that definition of intrastate commerce can encompass conveyances and movements and services within one state that never leave the state if it began or ended outside of the state. So just a little caution there for you. So if you operate as an intrastate carrier, you've defined yourself as such. Your drivers and your services don't begin or end outside of the state. You should follow your state's requirements, which Mark had mentioned, which is the same or different than the federal. Many states do adopt the federal rules verbatim, but we have seen that we have a team of editors, and a couple of them do track intrastate requirements, and we have found that there are exceptions for age, the vehicle size, medical issues, other topics. So it's important to know what your state's adopted. And then there's some that have adopted their own rules entirely. So in most states, compliance with these requirements, that's based on the vehicle weight or weight rating. These weight thresholds can vary, state to state. They can range from 10,001 pounds up, which Mark had mentioned. Some do mimic the CDL requirement definition. So it's important to do your research. So if you have a driver who is qualified in your state, it's important to realize that the driver might not be qualified to engage in interstate commerce, that is crossing state lines, or otherwise engage in interstate commerce, meaning being a link in a conveyance or service that begins or ends outside of the state. Even once, make sure the driver has to meet the federal standards. And if the driver has a CDL, that person may in fact have an intrastate only restriction on the license, depending on the state. Okay, so at this time, we're interested in your feedback, your comments, surprises, and what you learned, what we've discussed on the topic of who needs a DQ file. And in that Q&A box, which we can only see the comments. So just so you know, it's a very private chat. If you want to share your, questions, or if you got some wisdom to share with the group, some things that work for you, some things you've learned, put them in that chat. And while you're doing that, Mark, I think we had a question that came in before
we've already got a few of them.
Yeah, so if you want to grab before we get into
Crystal's asking, do I need to keep a full file, DQ file, including updates for a 1099 driver? And so 1099 driver is somebody that's contracted to the carrier to operate under that carrier's DOT number. So yes, you do. They are your driver for compliance purposes. That vehicle must be marked with your US DOT number and MCS 150 business name. There is zero difference. That if you look up the definition of an employee in 390.5, it just says anybody who's operating one of your CMVs, and if it has your DOT number on it, it's your CMV. Even if the owner operator or contractor owns the truck, they're leasing it to you to support your business. So hopefully that helps.
Yeah, I've got one that's saying, they have a question. It says, you have a driver helper. Do we need a DOT file on him if he never gets behind the wheel? Definition of a driver is someone who operates a commercial motor vehicle. If that person is never ever called upon to operate a CMV, they're not a driver by definition, and they would not need a DQ file. But you have to make sure that that is the case, especially with those non-CDL CMVs where you don't need a special licensing. You really need to make sure that that person's not operating the vehicle, like a big, large pickup truck, for example. Maybe you're not a carrier hauling goods on behalf of someone else. If that person's operating your company vehicle, that is the 10,001 pounds or greater, doesn't need a special licensing until the CDL definition kicks in. You need to absolutely make sure that person's not operating that vehicle even occasionally. Otherwise, they are a driver.
All right. Let's keep it rolling, but lots of questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, so sometimes we get asked what has to be in that DQ file and how long do you have to keep those documents? Those questions are easily answered, and I'm a reg nerd, so I'll give you some, if you're taking notes. It's actually on the slides, so you have the slides to refer to later. 391.51 and 391.53 are where you'd want to go for your resource. It's pretty straightforward. However, the more difficult question is usually from someone who just took over managing compliance for a carrier or after an acquisition. Well, what if required documents are missing from the file? What do you do? Well, we get this question all the time, and I've talked to a safety director not too long ago who was self-auditing the DQ files, and these predated this person. And a driver who had been with the company for quite some time, I believe was over a decade, never had a road test done, and they didn't do the previous employer checks. They weren't in the files. So how do you fix that kind of situation? Well, the first thing you can do is turn to subpart G to part 391 and see if there's any exceptions that might apply. If you figure out there was in fact a violation, and there's no way to erase these types of violations, things that should have been done at hire, you may be cited if you're caught by the FMCSA during an audit, but there are some things you can do to help minimize the damage, and show a good faith effort to comply. First, don't ever try to hide the violation. I can't stress that enough, because that's considered falsification. Carries a pretty hefty price tag if you're found in violation of that. You may even want to document in the file the fact that you know about the violation, you discovered it on a certain date, what steps are you doing to correct it. First, determine how long it's been missing. Ask whether it makes sense to actually create a document or fix the document maybe that was not partially completed, for example. Can you still contact the previous employer when it's a previous employer check? Does it make sense to get a road test? Or have the driver complete an application if that's missing? Or do you have an old copy of a CDL to use in place of a road test when the original road test is missing? Whatever your decision, be sure to document your efforts so the DOT knows that you made a good faith effort. You want to show you're doing everything possible to comply. And here's another caution: don't ever backdate anything. That's important because, again, that's another example of falsification, which has huge penalties. You don't want to be cited with that. And finally, make sure the violations don't happen again. Put a note in the file indicating you know about the violations and what controls you have in the future to prevent the violation. So if it was something that predates you, you might say that you're taking over the situation. You're going to have a pre-hired checklist, or maybe you're contracting with somebody like JJ Keller who has a Encompass software where everything's laid out for you, and you get notifications if something's missing. That way you won't miss it. So.
And thank you to Sarah for pointing out that I typed 391.53 twice on that slide you just covered. So anyway, unfortunately, rehire status is created with any break in employment, and I can't tell you how many times a month I get this question. So if you remove the driver from the roster, they are a rehire. Don't confuse the exception in the drug testing realm where if they're in a pool in the last 30 days, et cetera, a day break from in employment is considered a rehire. So the DQ file, in that case for a rehire, can't just pick up where it left off with a quick check of the medical card, make sure their license is still valid, et cetera. So if they were off for a seasonal layoff, they went off for a long vacation. I used to have drivers tick off for a month, but we knew they were coming back. We literally just updated their file when they got back, made sure their annual was done, their med card was still valid, license valid, all that stuff. But that was not a break in employment. So if they leave, they look for greener pastures, they come back, well, I made a mistake a week later, that's a rehire. They have to reapply, and they have to fill out a new application. You can reuse some stuff, but the initial MVR has to be rerun. If they worked for somebody while they were gone, which was how they, came to the conclusion that we weren't so bad, you have to fill that safety performance history out. The older safety performance histories that were done in the last 3 years, you can still reuse, and if their medical card's still good, you can reuse that as well. So for the non-CDL driver, you have 30 days from the rehire date to get the MVR, but you really don't want to do that because that's kind of risky. They could have had something bad happen while they were gone and the state updated their license. So I would certainly run that MVR sooner than later before they operate your CMV is best practice. So the CDL driver, if you're accepting a current medical card, and you didn't send them for yet another DOT exam, you have to run the MVR before they operate your CMV because 15 days after the DOT exam, the driver's medical card's no longer proof, so you have to run the MVR. We're updating you on the change that's coming in June where that's changing, but for now it's 15 days to get the MVR in the file after the DOT exam. But if you're accepting the card, run the MVR before you operate your CMV or do any safety sensitive functions. So you need a new note because you're rehiring drivers. You need a new note that you checked that the driver's medical examiner was on the registry. If you're sending them for a new exam, if you're accepting the old card, you have to again note that the medical examiner was on the registry at the time of that exam. And then the new driver application, they have to certify, they have to fill it out completely, compliant with 391.21 and certify it. And then from a drug testing perspective for CDL vehicle drivers, we have no other guidance other than you have to run a new clearinghouse query. Despite there being a pre-employment drug test exception, you'll get notified for a year if anything changes in that clearinghouse after you ran the query. The new pre-employment drug test has to happen unless they meet the criteria in 382.301B and documented per 382.301C. So essentially, if they were in your program in the last 30 days, then you can verify that. But and Kathy can talk about the ins and outs of using it. It may be more work than it's worth. Just send them for another drug test. So Kathy, what documents can you reuse or recycle?
Yeah, let's see what you can do that can help alleviate the administrative burden. If the driver had a road test certificate that was issued by your company or another FMCSA regulated carrier that was done within the past 3 years of the rehire date, you can reuse that. If it's older than 3 years, you must perform a new road test. And then a copy of the CDL that was used in lieu of a road test, if you use that option and it's in the original DQ file, if it's still the valid CDL and they haven't renewed their license, you can reuse that image. And you can also reuse safety performance histories that were previously completed if they fit within the 3 years from the rehire date. Now, for non-CDL drivers, you can reuse a copy of the medical exam under certificate. That is, if the driver didn't have a new exam while away, and you probably can reuse the note that you verified the examiner was certified. Again, if you know for sure they didn't go somewhere else in between there. Those items you can't recycle. Well, they're kept as if the driver never returned. That's for 3 years from the date of that separation. That includes that original application, safety performance histories that don't fall within the rehire date, road tests that are over 3 years old med cards, the initial MVR from the first hire date, all previous MVRs, and that includes ones that are the annual MVR or ones used for proof of medical certification for your CDL holders, all your annual reviews, all the annual list of violations of drivers, all that can be purged within 3 years of that of the time when the separation date.
All right, and for a time, I was getting repeated questions on, hey, is FMCSA forcing us to go to electronic records? They are not requiring electronic record keeping, hasn't even been talked about. It's allowed under 390.32. So many carriers, as a best practice, have already converted. They scan in the documents and store the images in a repository, or they're using an entirely electronic system like our Encompass system, where you can create everything in the system, store it. Auditing is 100 times easier than a bunch of hard copy in filing cabinets. Drivers can electronically sign most documents unless you have to send them off for verification to a third party. Then they have to see an electronic signatures, and you can use copies of hard copies as long as they're legible and they contain all the required information. You don't have to have hard copies laying around. You can destroy originals as long as they're reproduced electronically, readable, and have everything they need. And it certainly keeps electronic records, keeps your files much more organized. And if you have extra non-DOT documents like personnel documents, I would just suggest don't put them in the DQ file, because when an auditor comes, they expect to see, if you have hard copies, left side permanent stuff, right side renewable stuff. Not a lot of performance data for 5 or 10 years, all their counseling forms. They should have a personnel file for that. That's my opinion. It's not a requirement, but if you combine them, you have to have it at the highest level of security required by the documents that are in there. And if you do run electronic records, just be prepared to print them on demand if an auditor wants to see that. And drug and alcohol records, they certainly are better stored separately as the records. You don't want to mix those up with DQ records as well, and they have more strict security requirements than the DQ file. And record keeping in this area, you certainly want a mechanism in place to verify everything you have, everything you need to get, and the timeliness of it. So consider using an online fleet management system like J.J. Keller's Encompass to make sure that you stay on track. Spreadsheets didn't cut it when I was managing a fleet not that many years ago. I would have loved a system like Encompass. So if you're not already using Encompass and want to learn more, check it out. Select the poll for your interests. And if you're looking for an excellent resource, I did consult Kathy when I was creating this thing. This DQ inventory checklist is, I think, excellent because it calls out the documents you need by category, whether it's for CDL drivers only. There's a separate column that checks that box, so you can tell, well, this is what I need for non-CDL, this is what I need for CDL. So I would get it if I were you, if nothing else, as a training document. Mm-hmm. All right. So, Kathy.
So yeah, we'll take a couple questions. Or for the benefit of the audience, we'd like you to do some comments. If you've got comments, maybe you want to, if you can succinctly put in a little comment about what you've done that works, even a little advice, or if you want to put questions in, that use that Q&A box. Talk about how you're storing your record keeping file system, benefits of electronic files if you use them, experience you had in converting them. Maybe I know that it's like if you got like a whole filing cabinet full of hard copies, advice on that. Just share your wisdom. And I got a question I'm going to answer as you guys are doing that. I have one saying that Ken's asking that, saying that they're having a little trouble at their company, their HR department, about putting the employment history in the DQ file, and the HR department wants to keep that background check and they separate, stay private. Would that pass an audit? Well, it comes down to the safety performance history records request in 391.53 has to be stored in a secured location, controlled access, and only those involved with the hiring process should really have access. And that's 391.53. So it's technically a separate file, even though you could, in theory, put it all together in one folder, as long as that whole more stringent record keeping applies to the whole combined file. But if your HR wants to have the background checks in a separate filing system, you can do that as long as you're able to assemble all the pieces for the DOT when they come for an audit. There's nothing prohibiting you from separating it out from other, like for example, some carriers might have the application with the HR and maybe some background checks, and they might have the some renewable type of stuff like the annual review at the location. As long as you're able to put everything together during an audit and everything shows as being there, where your repository is for different pieces is not looked at, but you have to be able to assemble it quickly and have it in the order based on driver file. Mark, anything else you want to add on that?
Tori has two. Oh, no, I have nothing to add. You always cover stuff very thoroughly.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Tori has two questions. You're welcome. Tori has two questions. Is a driver's license and med card considered expired on the date on the document or the day after on the date on the document? It's the date after. So medical cards are good. You can drive on that card on the expiration date, but you can't drive on that card the day after. And the same goes for licenses. And that comes from a seasoned CDL driver, Tom Bray, confirmed that, because it kind of doesn't say that anywhere in writing in 391.43 where it's supposed to be, or where it should be. All right.
And then just a little clarification, Chris is asking about, just for sure, for rehires, do you need a new road test? If the existing road test is over 3 years old, you would need a new one, yes. Can't recycle the existing one.
You don't want to pass up an opportunity to watch your driver's skills and attitudes. And even our most experienced drivers, when we sent them out on road checks every 2 years, they appreciated, most of them appreciated the fact that we caught some of their bad habits and they were given a chance to fix them. So just my 2
And that just leads us perfectly into our next topic.
Oh,
who needs
goodness.
a road test and when? Wow. Who could have figured that one out? That's perfect. And that was not a staged question. Krista's a real person. We didn't stage that question, just so you guys know. Anyway, let's answer that question. Who needs the road test? The same answer as who needs a DQ file. Anyone operating a commercial motor vehicle, and that's that definition in 390.5. They're operating under your DOT number. Who can perform that road test? Anyone you, the carrier, deem is qualified or competent to do so. It could be someone in-house, like a supervisor. Maybe you're going to, use a seasoned driver to take out an applicant, or maybe you contract out if you want to. You can do that. Just has to be a person that you feel is capable of judging the driver's abilities. If testing in a CDL vehicle, however, you want to, the evaluator probably should hold a CDL in case something does go wrong during the test. You might have to have that vehicle driven back in case it doesn't go well. When should the road test be performed? Well, that's before the first dispatch or any work in support of the business. Well, you're saying, well, aren't there any exceptions? Well, yeah, there are. You probably heard about, we talked about that CDL in lieu of road test in 391.33, which you can use a copy of a CDL in lieu of road test, except when it's you're assigning the driver to a tank vehicle, double or triple vehicle. You need to do a road test. And then that 3 years you talked about for the rehire, well, same thing. If somebody comes to you, hired off the street, and they have a copy of a road test certificate from a former employer, and it's less than 3 years old or less, you can use that. But I would caution on that, because if you accept somebody else's road test certificate, you don't know what their standards are. And you can do a pre-employment drug test after the road test for those CDL holders, and before the first dispatch, and that's according to FMCSA guidance. A finer point is that the vehicle cannot be used, again, the dispatch, part of the road test, you can't, let's say we're taking them to like a short little run, that doesn't qualify for the pre-employment drug test. You have to have the results if that's how you do your road tests. If there's any doubt as to whether your road test supports the business operations or otherwise in commerce, you'll have to do the query and receive a negative drug test result before that road test. So just like if they were hired, even though they're not necessarily hired at that point. As far as the pre-employment query of the CDL driver, that can be done after the road test, as long as it's done before hiring the driver. That's how the word is before you hire the driver. Okay.
No lack of questions. So let me,
No.
Let's see. Natalie's asking, do we need a DQ file for hotshot drivers, non-CDL? If those more than likely hotshot drivers are operating in interstate commerce, even if they're pulling freight out of a warehouse. If that freight came from out of state and is just simply being redeployed on a separate bill of lading, there's a 1992 Interstate Commerce Commission memorandum that says stuff going into a warehouse and coming out on a different bill of lading is still interstate commerce. But if it's truly intrastate commerce, the DQ file for a hotshot driver would depend on the size of the vehicle and the state's adoption of the regulations.
I have a question asking, is there a list somewhere of what we should be looking for in a road test? Yes, there is, Elizabeth. 391.31 has a list of categories that you'd probably use on a scoring sheet of some sort, because you're supposed to be required to keep a document of the road test. J.J. Keller, for example, does sell a road test scoring sheet based on those areas of common things you should be looking for to see their abilities to safely and handle your vehicle. So yes, 391.31.
Katrina's asking, what about third-party mechanics? That is a not often asked question, but it's kind of ignored because it's anybody operating your CMV is a driver for you. So that third-party mechanic would have to be fully qualified by you. That's the black and white answer. How people handle it, I think they just sign an agreement to have the other driver, the third-party mechanic, drive your trucks, come and pick them up, let's say. But the reality is, if you landed in court and that third-party mechanic crashed on the way back to their maintenance facility, you're on the hook for making sure that driver is qualified under 391.51 is the DQ file, correct DQ file
Right.
documents list. All right.
Okay. So now we begin. You can begin to submit questions or comments. We've had a lot of questions. We haven't had much, sage wisdom. We'd like to have you if you have things that you worked for you, or things that didn't, that you found a procedure that fixed it. We're going to cover background checks, including motor vehicle records or MVRs, the driving records. A common question this year has been: do we still need the driver's consent to request prior FMCSA regulated employers' dates of employment and DOT crashes in the past 3 years? That's what's currently on the safety performance history. The safety performance history no longer includes the DOT drug and alcohol history. FMCSA testing violations, well, they're learned through queries of the Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse. For pre-employment queries, the driver does the consent through a personal clearinghouse account when the employer requests it. So it's not done externally. the driver worked for another mode, maybe the railroad or airlines or transit authority, maybe a pipeline job, maritime, you contact those former DOT employers directly about the DOT testing violations under that mode, not FMCSA. That's because the clearinghouse only captures the FMCSA Part 382 violations. In those instances, you need the driver's specific written consent in order for that former employer to respond to those questions about DOT testing history. Now let's get back to that safety performance history format. To be compliant with the privacy laws that may apply, we still recommend that you get the driver's consent, even though there's no longer drug and alcohol history questions on it. It's just a good safeguard when you're requesting dates of employment, DOT accident verifications, and any other, general questions you might be asking. We do recommend that. And how do you document the inquiry to the previous employers? Well, always keep a copy of any inquiries you sent. Note that who the information was sent to, when it was sent. In the safety performance history file, that 391.53, you keep that for the length of employment plus 3 years. And you keep a copy of any information sent out to the drivers, like on your drivers. Like if you're the former employer and you're getting that request, you keep a record of what you sent in response for 1 year. A fairly hot topic is that FMCSA does not prohibit prior employers from charging fees. We get that, and that's been since 2004, I think, since safety performance history was a final rule, and we're still getting that question: can they charge us a fee? And FMCSA says yes, they can. You're expected to make a good faith effort when it comes to inquiries. The regs are not specific, but a common practice is to make more than one attempt. They use the word plural in the regs in that first 30 days and document all your attempts. And industry best practice is 3 attempts. Some carriers, for instance, they might mail the first attempt, then document a follow-up phone call. Or you can mail it again, or maybe do an email attachment if you have an email of the former, the company or the former manager. Just document whatever medium by which you sent it, what you sent, to whom and when, shows you've done your due diligence. And the new hire investigation, well, you need to consent for running licensing checks, MVRs, depends on the respective agency, the state licensing agency. So the main thing to remember is that you must follow whatever the procedures are. And some states require a signature and a consent. Others, you might be able to order them online with minimal administrative things on the driver's part. So, okay.
All right, so we're out of that subject in the background check questions. So throw them at us if you have them. Let me see here. I have a quick question, or not really a quick question. Jamie's asking, how do we handle drivers hired through agencies? Well, if they're in your vehicle, there is no difference. You are the employer. If you look up employer definition in 390.5, you are the one that's operating the vehicle. The employee definition is anyone operating your vehicle, including a driver, leased contractors, etc. So 391.51 lists all the documents that you have to have in their DQ file. There is an exception in 391.63 that says if the driver is fully qualified by another carrier through that temp agency, but the carrier must have qualified them. The temp agency's DQ file matters not. I've never seen anything in writing that says, hey, it's okay for you to use temp agency DQ files because they're not a carrier, A, and B, that driver has maybe worked for that carrier for 3 or 4 years, but worked for many others. A carrier that has used that driver must have fully qualified the driver, and then the driver has to work for 2 or more DOT carriers in a 7-day period in order for you to get any break on the DQ file. So 391.63 is the exception. You have to collect a mini DQ file, as we call it. It's just minimal information: driver name, social security number, licensing state, and something else, I think. But believe me, in most cases that doesn't apply because they're at your place for certainly more than a week, and they probably don't bounce back and forth. They stay at your place for 7 consecutive days or more. And if you're the only one they drove for, that exception doesn't matter. you have to do the full DQ file.
Okay. Well, I think we'll probably continue on to our next topic then, because we've got a lot of good stuff yet to share.
Yep. All right. So there's not enough time to deep dive into sleep apnea and all the intricacies, but one thing I will share with you is I'm getting questions every week or every other week about a driver who went to an exam and was ordered to get a sleep study, and they don't want that exam. They want to go to another examiner. So what happened was they were assigned, the examiner has concerns about the driver having respiratory dysfunction, which is 391.41b5. If you have respiratory dysfunction that causes you to be unsafe behind the wheel, like daytime sleepiness, they can send you, but aren't required to send you for a sleep eval. So that's where sleep apnea shows up, 391.41b5. There's a little bit about it in the medical advisory criteria, that's Appendix A. And certainly the rewrite of the CME handbook that I did for our Keller product, more than a year ago now, says absolutely you're not required to. The examiners are not required to send them for another evaluation, but in many cases that driver is tired during the day, is having problems, and shared something with that first examiner that was concerning, or they're just going by neck size, throat, Mallampati score, and some other stuff, and they're kind of automatically triaging them for an appointment. It's up to you. You're the carrier. You're at risk. That driver crashes in your vehicle. Your policies and procedures and requirements to make sure that driver's medically qualified come first. If there's a crash, examiner's probably sued second in line. I'm just being frank. So if you allow that driver to go to anybody they want, they can go for a second opinion. However, they have to share an accurate health history. Well, how do you know? Well, you really don't unless you get driver consent to pull the long form from both. And if the driver is not truthful in that second exam is considered falsified, and FMCSA could go after the driver for civil penalties. They're doing some reviewing. I've heard very little about it, but anyway, it's a dicey subject. Remember, your policies and procedures have to ensure that driver's safe on the road. And sleep apnea just happens to be a sensitive area where drivers wind up having costly remedies, so they want another opinion, and they're going to look for the opinion that they want. So are the procedures same in the medical certification space for CDL and non-CDL? They sure are, right up until you have to record it in the DQ file. CDL drivers, this medical certificate for the foreseeable future is going to be the only proof you need. CDL drivers require a copy of the CDL MVR with the expiration date of the medical certification in the file within 15 days of the last exam, because it's tied to the license. So currently, until June 23rd, 2025, the CDL drivers have to self-certify every single exam to get that new expiration date. But the examiner database, the registry, is going to be tied to every state by June 23rd if everything goes well. And within a couple of days, as we're seeing with Georgia and Wisconsin, that's what they said it will take, that the driver won't have to go to the DMV anymore, and you won't have to verify that the examiner was on the registry. But don't change anything until FMCSA actually says this thing is in motion. Georgia was supposed to start February 24th, and they were put on hold that afternoon. So nothing is off the ground. No states are doing this process until FMCSA reviews it. I just talked about all this stuff. The warning is that CDL drivers can't forget to self-certify their driving type also. They still have to do that. So anytime they get a new CDL or commercial learner's permit, they upgrade their CDL or they renew their CDL, they still have to say, I am interstate non-accepted if you're required to get a medical exam. Intrastate non-accepted. Intrastate accepted. Accepted just means you don't need a medical exam. So make sure they understand things are going to change. Use this slide for reference, and make sure they understand that that driving type still applies.
Okay, so how long do you keep your MVRs? Because of the differences in CDL and non-CDL driver for proof of medical certifications, there's often some confusion here. The new hire MVRs, or basically MVRs, it's like basically it's for the duration of employment plus 3 years. So that's the initial MVR is kept that long. So don't purchase those MVRs when after 3 years like you do your annual MVRs. The annual MVRs or the MVRs used to verify a CDL driver's medical certification is kept for 3 years. So don't inadvertently purge that new hire one. To clarify, since this has come up as of late, there is no requirement for a CDL driver to get a new DOT exam when they transfer to a new state after they obtained a new state license. Within 30 days of they establish new residency, they got to transfer their license. They don't need a new exam. An exam performed by a certified medical examiner that's on the registry, properly licensed by a state in which the exam was performed. That's good in all 50 states, just so you know. So it's fine to turn that into any DMV. The concern is that the license number on the medical card won't match up with the MVR information. We've had that question. The prior state's license should show in the CIDLIS CDL information system as being surrendered or a similar status. So it's all tied. The IT things they have in place do connect that driver's identity and their stuff. So failing to maintain initial driving record in a driver qualification file, well, how much will that cost you? Well, the maximum fine is $3,600. So it's an important thing to watch for, and make sure you're the team that manages your DQ files understands how long things are kept. The annual MVRs, proof of medical certifications, like I just said, are kept for at least 3 years. So don't purge too soon. Okay, so let's take some questions on MVRs that have come in. And Mark, do you have one lined up to grab?
Well, I don't have MVR questions, but
I have one that combined MVRs with the clearinghouse. There was one that came in. It said, do you need to have consent every year for the driver's annual MVRs and the clearinghouse checks? Or is the original one good through their employment? For the MVRs, that would be based on what the state requires for a consent of sorts. So we can't address that. That's state by state. The clearinghouse, though that's not an MVR question, it's still a good question, is for the annual limited queries, which are requested and the consent is done outside of the clearinghouse. You could design a form, and J.J. Keller's form is written in that fashion. That's written in a way that says this is valid annually through the course of employment. So you wouldn't have to request an annual limited query consent form if you had it worded in that way. Typically, carriers will have them sign something during the orientation, so it's on file, ready to go. So if they do a batch where all their annual clearinghouse queries are done once a year, they've got the record ready to roll. So yeah, it depends how you want to word your consent for the clearinghouse. Okay, so we'll move right along here. What if you're not compliant with driver qualification rules? What are the ramifications? We always get that, what's it going to cost us? Well, it's going to cost you a poor CSA score, possibly being flagged for an intervention. What's an intervention? Well, it can range from a warning letter saying, hey, you're on our radar, you better get safety management controls in place and get your systems management in place, or it could be an on-site investigation or an audit by FMCSA. You could have an out of service order. The whole gamut's there, depending on your CSA scores. Another result of non-compliance during an on-site or remote audit could be acute or critical violations. An acute is a one-time violation that could lead directly to an accident. Critical violations show a pattern equal to 10% of the documents audited. It's a breakdown of your safety management controls. It comes down to that they don't see your systems as working. For example, auditors can compare work assignments when licensing was suspended or medical certificate, maybe it lapsed, determine if the driver was operating when they weren't qualified. And you can bet an attorney will see that too if the driver's ever in a crash. They'll compare the same documents. Missing DQ files that we talked about, such as MVRs and medical certificates, will be caught during an audit. Besides a conditional or unsatisfactory safety ratings from FMCSA, fines and penalties, we've been throwing some numbers out there for you. And you probably know property carrying and CSA scores were removed from the public view. Probably will remain hidden for a while yet. CSA is still kind of under development to be revamped. We're waiting on that. However, they are still available to look at in your own account when you log in, and they're still being used by enforcement. There's enough information in CSA that's visible enough for your customers to question about your performance. And you can still see passenger CSA scores. That's still in the public view. So if you're a passenger carrier, you probably are all aware of that. I recently had a question from a customer, and they were asking about their CSA scores because, well, their insurance agent wanted to see them. And I've heard of customers and brokers that have been asking to see CSA scores because they're not public. And even though you have to see your terms of agreement, but yeah, you might have to provide that. So don't be surprised if you're asked to share them as a term of doing business, and so they're not hidden from public in a sense. They can request it.
And just quickly, this is an eye chart, but this is a great study that Darren Hansen, another editor, did. 4 years worth of FMCSA audit fines are in here, and the min or the average and the maximum, just for reference, because we get asked for these numbers often, so you can show your leadership. All right, if we don't do well, or if we don't do a mock audit and they catch something, here's what could happen. So the average is, probably more likely what you'd see after an audit if you have those problems, but the maximums are listed there as well. Record keeping is always of interest, $1,584 per day up to $15,846 for carriers. Known falsifications over 15 grand, but you can look at the actuals. Falsification tops the list around 7 grand, with 40,000 being the worst. Not checking MVRs, that's a bad one. That's at number 2, cost $3,400 average, and 17,000 was the maximum.
All right, and you can find. Oh, I'm ready to go, Mark. You can find that information in the slide deck, which is in the handouts, which you can find in the console at the top. So before we move on to our Q&A session, we would like to thank our webcast sponsor, J.J. Keller and Compass Fleet Management System. For those who joined us later in the event, or for those who missed the opportunity earlier, we're offering all attendees a chance to learn more about the Encompass platform and how you can benefit from it. Manage all of your fleet operations in one place and let Encompass automate those tasks for you. So once again, we've got a poll up for you. Please complete that. If there's areas that we can assist you with, definitely check more than one. Use that poll, like I said, to select your interests. And once again, if you're looking for an excellent resource around this topic, J.J. Keller, which includes Mark and Kathy, have created a DQ inventory checklist. You can download your copy right now by clicking on the link in the resource box. We don't want you to miss out on that. And now I'll pass it back to Mark and Kathy, and they will address the remaining questions with the 7 minutes or so that we've got left.
Hey, Kathy, Seth had a question about MVRs a while ago, and it was a combo. Can you address it? It's number 32.
Oh, let me look in the our little.
I put it in your basket.
Oh, you did. We
have
technology behind the scenes. Okay, can the employee permission to check the MVR in any drug test be verbal, or should it be something in writing? Well, the drug and alcohol piece must be in writing. Specific written consent goes back to Part 40. That includes the clearinghouse or check whether it be at hire. That's done in writing, and then the consent's done electronically in the clearinghouse. The annual limited one has to be either, it could be an electronic form with the consent, or it could be a hard copy where the driver signs, but there has to be a signature. It can be a signature, online of some sort, or it has to be a hard copy with a physical signature. But for the drug and alcohol history, must be a signature, but nothing verbal. As far as the MVR, it depends on what the state requires for record keeping. We don't track to that degree, unfortunately. That's more of a state administrative process versus regulations. But if you do a Fair Credit Reporting Act and you have a third party requesting them on your behalf, that's a whole nother can of worms. And if you want information on that, you can contact us after the webcast. We have a whole team of HR experts who kind of tell you what's required for consents when it comes to using third party consumer reporting agencies. Okay. I have one that goes back to our road test thing. Can a CDL always be used in lieu of a road test? If the driver is hired to operate a double, triple, or tank vehicle, you must have a road test, because the intention of using a CDL in lieu of a road test is the fact that to get their CDL, the state DMV did a physical road test with the driver. And you're using that state's road test in lieu of your own. But they don't do road tests for those particular vehicle types and those endorsements. So that's when you would need an actual road test on a representative vehicle.
All right. Corey is asking, they're saying he's the third safety director in a while. They've all done the applications a different way. What you have to do is pull the applications out and then compare the application questions to 391.21B. There's 12 or 13 items that have to be on there, including the Social Security number and birth date. So 391.21B, I would compare. We have a great ADA compliant application on jjkeller.com. You can check that as a reference. Also, there might be a PDF, or not PDF, but a image online that you could use to magnify and see what's all on there.
I have a question. I know, Mark, we've heard this time and time again. There was no file on our driver when I took this over. That happens. That wasn't my mistake. What do I do? He's been worked here for 7 years. Do I need to do a background check on him and put it in the file? Well, I'll tell you that it's kind of 7 years is one of those borderline time frames, because for the DOT accident history, it's the last 3 years worth of crashes from the date of hire, and the accident register is only kept for 3 years. They may not have a record of that. They may have record of the general employment verification, like dates of employment. They may have vehicles operated and some other high level information. So, I would say it's worth a shot, but you may find, and you'd have to make sure the form has the dates related to dates of employment, not 3 years from today's date, even though the driver's signing today's date on the consent. But make sure it's 3 years from the date of hire, so the previous employer knows what date range to provide information. They may come back, we don't have anything on them. But I'd say it's due diligence in the event there's ever a crash involving this driver. If he's been with you 10, 15, 20 years, odds are that former employer is not going to have record of him. 7 years is kind of questionable. It's like past retention for some of the documents. The DQ file is purged after 3 years. So, but it might be worth a shot. Worst case scenario, they come back, no information available. We don't have that record on that person anymore.
All right. Sherry's asking, do all employees driving a company vehicle have to have a medical card? Not unless they're driving a commercial motor vehicle that met the definition at the beginning of the webcast. So if they're driving small vans or something that are not rated for more than 8 for compensation, 10,000, and the vehicles are property carrying 10,001 pounds or more, or any size hauling placardable hazmat, they are not required to have a medical card. But anybody can get in an accident. You might want to have some non-DOT medical certification, because if they have a medical event, you're still on the hook, even if they're driving a company vehicle.
Well, it looks like we're at the top of the hour. Boy, this hour went by fast. And
Yes, thanks for
Mark,
all the
again,
great
happy
questions.
birthday to you.
Oh, thank
I
you.
hope your day is a great day. And
It already
it
is,
was a
because
pleasure
I
working
got to
with you.
present with you to these great people.
You can't beat that. That's the best birthday gift of all, right, Mark?
That's right.
Well,
When you're a
thanks to
reg nerd,
everyone.
it is.
Exactly. We're glad we have reg nerds with us. Thanks to everyone who joined us today. We hope you found this webcast both informative and engaging. Your participation, we had great participation today, over 40 questions have been invaluable to us, and we appreciate your time and attention. If we didn't get to your question, we'll be sure to have someone follow up. Now, within 24 hours, you can expect a thank you for attending email that will contain the link to today's recording. Before you log off, please take a moment to complete our post-event survey. Mark and Kathy put a lot of work into planning these webcasts, so your feedback is crucial in helping us improve future webcasts and better serve your needs. So we thank you for joining us, and we wish you a very safe day.